Why are you still running exposure models at 2 in the morning? Owen Harper's voice cut through the conference room glass like a blade wrapped in silk. I didn't look up from my screen. Just kept scrolling through the derivative mapping I'd been untangling for the past 3 hours. My security badge dangled from my blazer pocket, barely visible under the desk lamp that cast long shadows across the empty floor. If they thought a performance review downgrade would make me vanish quietly, they'd seriously underestimated who had been holding the structural integrity of Revix Capital's debt architecture together for the last decade. That evening, the 43rd floor was almost entirely vacant. Just me, a temperamental coffee maker that sputtered every 11 minutes, and the persistent whir of backup servers that housed Revix's entire portfolio framework. Every leverage point, every counterparty agreement, every hidden liability buried in subsidiaries 3 layers deep. I understood them intimately because I'd architected them, not as weapons but as safeguards. The kind that only function properly when someone knows exactly which levers to pull. For nearly 12 years, I'd existed in the footnotes of their quarterly presentations. Senior derivative strategist. Never featured in investor roadshows. Never acknowledged during earnings announcements. But when an acquisition was about to implode because of a forgotten put option buried in the documentation, my phone would ring. Always urgently, always with barely concealed desperation. Madison, they'd say with that particular tone of forced casualness, could you review something quickly? And I always did. Until December 28th. That was the afternoon Human Resources distributed their organizational efficiency initiative. Corporate doublespeak for we're restructuring your compensation because you prevented too many disasters without making enough noise about it. One name appeared explicitly in the distribution list. Everyone else received department-wide notifications with vague language about recalibration. But my name sat there in bold text under a section titled Individual Performance Concerns. Senior derivative strategist flagged for expectation misalignment and advisory scope overreach. Misalignment. Elegant phrasing for the fact that I'd blocked an $18 million convertible bond issuance that contained embedded liquidation preferences tied to a pharmaceutical partner currently under FDA investigation. I'd flagged the exposure. They'd pushed back aggressively. I'd refused to sign off. The board quietly supported my position naturally. When that pharmaceutical company's regulatory violations went public 6 weeks later, Revix walked away completely clean. Saved the firm just over $6.2 million in potential liability. My reward? A compensation freeze and a memo written like I'd somehow failed to understand their strategic vision. If you're finding value in this story, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd like the video and subscribe. Honestly, about 96% of viewers don't, and it really helps our small team continue creating content like this. Thank you so much. But returning to that memo. I read it 5 times straight. Not because the language confused me. I could decode passive-aggressive corporate speak from 3 continents away. No, I read it repeatedly because I needed the anger to crystallize properly. I needed it to settle into something cold and permanent. Then I closed the document without responding, didn't schedule any meeting with Human Resources, didn't inform my team. They were already overwhelmed managing a cross-border merger and 2 simultaneous divestitures. They didn't need to worry about structural failures when they were still operating within frameworks I'd constructed years earlier. Instead, I accessed my private documentation archive, retrieved the complete derivative exposure matrix. 12 years of careful mapping. Entity interconnections, breach triggers, embedded option clauses, acceleration provisions, each one meticulously documented, legally verified, and because I'd never trusted a single executive above my pay grade, digitally watermarked with my unique identifier. At that moment, I didn't consider it preparation for retaliation. I viewed it as documentation. Because the fundamental truth about derivative networks is this: they're not isolated instruments. They're interconnected systems. One contractual breach in a single entity and the cascade doesn't merely spread, it accelerates exponentially. The instant someone forgets which provision links which subsidiary to which credit facility, that's when the entire structure begins fracturing. I didn't expose anything immediately, but I did execute a comprehensive diagnostic scan. For issues surfaced within minutes. Individually minor but collectively interwoven. Ticking time bombs in the foundation. I documented each one, generated detailed exposure reports, And before logging off for what they presumably believed would be my final session, I uploaded a complete copy of the derivative matrix into the central compliance repository. Time-stamped, officially archived, unacknowledged by anyone. Then I placed my security badge inside the top desk drawer. No theatrical gestures, no resignation letter. The infrastructure remained stable. But the pressure points were now active and waiting. I noticed it while standing in line at the coffee shop down the block, still half-conscious, hair damp from the sleet I'd walked through because someone had decided Revix's main entrance needed emergency repairs during the final week of December. The internal bulletin arrived at 7:19 a.m. Subject line: 2025 Compensation Framework, Tiered Performance Adjustments. Corporate announcements always begin softly. Realignment, optimization, strategic recalibration. But buried 2/3 through the bureaucratic fog was the only sentence that actually mattered. Due to advisory scope concerns and impact measurement variance, senior derivative strategist compensation will remain frozen pending further evaluation. Not under review. Not temporary adjustment. Just a clean guillotine drop. First casualty of the new fiscal year. I didn't need to scroll further to confirm nobody else was specifically named. Just me. I stood there gripping my paper cup like it might suddenly provide answers. Staring at my own name like I'd hallucinated it into existence. As though I'd somehow invented an entire quarter where I'd quietly saved their institutional reputation again and again. Blocked exposure to 4 unstable counterparties with deteriorating credit profiles. Identified a structured note with hidden mandatory conversion language that would have diluted existing shareholders by 11%. Caught a vendor payment system inadvertently routing funds through an entity flagged by OFAC sanctions monitoring. All documented meticulously. All acknowledged internally. And then the pharmaceutical disaster I mentioned. I'd blocked that $18 million convertible bond facility 3 weeks before Christmas. They'd been euphoric about it, assembling presentations about emerging healthcare verticals while I was quietly reading footnotes in SEC regulatory filings. That partner was actively under federal investigation for clinical trial data manipulation. I flagged it immediately. Finance protested loudly. I held my ground. Legal reluctantly backed my assessment. The CFO himself called me excessively cautious during a tense conference call. 9 weeks later, the pharmaceutical stock collapsed 81% in a single trading session. If Revix had executed that facility, we'd be listed as a material counterparty in every public filing by Monday morning. Said nothing. Zero exposure, no crisis management, no shareholder lawsuits, just silence as though it never existed. And now this bulletin. Punishment disguised as fiscal discipline, informing me that my expectations had been misaligned. I stared at that phrase for an extended moment. Then I closed my phone, collected my coffee, walked upstairs. I passed Derek from Treasury Operations in the lobby. "Hey Madison," he said with forced casualness. "Saw the compensation bulletin. Just want you to know it's not personal or anything." I stopped walking. Of course it's not personal. It's institutional negligence, but I appreciate the clarification. He started to respond, but I was already moving. No point wasting energy on people who believe a risk strategist's job is to smile politely while the infrastructure burns. At my workstation I sat down, exhaled slowly, pulled up the audit trail. That bulletin wasn't merely cowardice. It was fundamentally dangerous. Because when you publicly undermine the person holding the architectural blueprints to your entire derivative structure, you'd better be absolutely certain they're replaceable. And I wasn't replaceable. They understood that perfectly. That's precisely why my system access remained completely active. My credentials untouched, my administrative clearances intact. The vault containing the derivative exposure matrix still linked to my digital authentication signature. Which meant one of two possibilities. Either they planned to quietly handle the next crisis and pretend I was never essential. Or they'd already forgotten how deep the foundation actually went. How I'd built every layer like a fault line specifically designed to hold under normal conditions. But only under normal conditions. Let them proceed. Let them discuss alignment and efficiency. I understood what was coming next. Not because I wanted it to happen, but because I'd already constructed the mechanisms that would make it inevitable. I didn't slam the drawer shut. Didn't deliver some dramatic farewell speech to an empty office. I simply set the badge down carefully like it still represented something worth respecting and slid the drawer closed. Let them construct their HR narrative later. She departed suddenly. Perhaps she was experiencing burnout. But I wasn't burned out. I was fundamentally insulted. There's a critical difference. Packing required 9 minutes. One laptop, one charging cable, an encrypted drive that technically wasn't authorized to leave the premises. But then again, neither was my professional dignity. I logged out of my system at exactly 9:54 a.m. Not that anyone was paying attention. Most of the team was focused intently on preparing reports they didn't realize were already structurally misaligned. The entire risk framework was already shifting, just subtly enough to appear stable if you didn't understand which stress points to examine. And I understood exactly which stress points to examine. Before departing, I executed one final diagnostic scan. Not the obvious kind that generates alerts. The forensic kind. I'd programmed a passive monitoring system years earlier, concealed within a generic legacy backup utility designation. It activated only when specific conditions aligned simultaneously: threshold deviation in derivative exposure, delays in counterparty payment schedules, and most critically, any irregularity in covenant compliance reporting frequency. 4 flags illuminated. The first involved a subsidiary entity designated V83, created the previous April. Quietly registered in Delaware. Nothing remarkable unless you noticed its silent linkage to a 2020 cross-collateralization provision. The identical provision I'd personally drafted. The identical provision they'd quietly removed from the most recent board materials. The second was a debt servicing delay. 51 days overdue unannounced. Probably deferred with a bridge facility someone forgot to properly document. Ordinarily minor, but this particular delay was connected to a vendor payment system that synchronized with quarterly performance covenants. Meaning if that bridge facility defaulted, a cascade would initiate. Small initially, then fast, then brutal. The third flag disturbed me more than it should have. An intercompany fund transfer delay between 2 subsidiaries in Singapore and Luxembourg. Invisible to most observers. But that delay indicated one thing. Someone in the chain was moving capital late or not moving it at all, hoping nobody would notice the discrepancy. They'd notice eventually. The fourth flag was almost elegant in its danger. A derivatives portfolio at one of the subsidiaries had breached its variance threshold by 2.7%. Alone meaningless. But connected to the other 3 flags through the cross-collateralization provision I'd written, it became a trigger mechanism. I compiled all 4 flags into a clean diagnostic report, time-stamped it with official system credentials, and uploaded it silently to the internal risk repository. Then I opened the derivative exposure matrix, the complete version. 12 years of tracking, cross-default mapping, counterparty breach triggers, covenant history, all the complex webbing that transforms a simple credit facility into a corporate time bomb. I uploaded a read-only version to the Global Compliance Archive. It didn't overwrite existing documentation. Didn't trigger any alerts. Just existed there, waiting like a loaded weapon someone had forgotten they were carrying. Then I encrypted the master version under my private cryptographic key and archived it to an external secure server. Not to leak information, not to extort anyone, just to preserve the truth. I stood up, walked once around the entire floor. No goodbyes, no emotional farewells. Just the quiet mechanical sound of elevator doors closing behind me. My reflection in the brushed steel looked composed, but internally I was already reviewing 12 years of institutional memory. Back to when I genuinely believed people would value the systems that protected them. The reality, they never noticed the walls I'd been holding up. But they were about to notice what happens when those walls develop cracks. It arrived at approximately 11:23 p.m., the way these situations always materialize. You're attempting to sleep. You believe you've walked away cleanly. Then that small vibration hums against your phone like a pulse from your former life. Blind copy. Treasury Department thread. Subject line. Preliminary Materials Q1 Board Review Package. I hadn't anticipated being included on anything. Not after the compensation bulletin, not after I'd departed. But institutional memory dies slowly. And apparently someone had forgotten that my email address still existed on several automated distribution lists buried in Outlook macros from hell. So I opened it. It was a forwarded chain, Treasury bouncing around slide deck drafts for the upcoming Q1 board presentation. Tight formatting. Same useless stock imagery. Pages of reassurance language wrapped in spreadsheet aesthetics. But then I reached slide 19. Covenant compliance overview. There was chart after chart of debt ratios, performance metrics, stress test projections, forecasts. Clean, digestible, professionally executed. Except the seizure provision was gone. Not missing accidentally. Rewritten, replaced, sanitized. Where the 2020 asset seizure protocol should have been. A provision I'd spent entire weekends perfecting after the Castellan fund collapse. It was now just generic boilerplate. Standard, toothless fallback language, vague enough to mean essentially nothing and safe enough to slide past directors who didn't ask challenging questions. It read like an instruction manual for a household appliance. In the event of unanticipated creditor challenges, Revix Capital reserves the right to pursue commercially reasonable remedies as deemed appropriate. Commercially reasonable. That provision used to have actual enforcement mechanisms. Real teeth. Provision 9.2b, the one we drafted to trigger automatic asset liens across subsidiary entities in the event of covenant threshold breaches. It was designed for systemic containment. It mapped intercompany obligations like arterial pressure monitoring. One rupture and it locked down across 42 flagged subsidiaries simultaneously. It had saved us twice in 2021, once in 2023, and now it was deleted. Gone. Replaced with a sentence so soft you could use it as a pillow. I scrolled back to the thread origin. Initial sender. Lucas Bennett, Treasury Operations Director. Timestamp. 11:07 p.m. No copy to risk management. No copy to legal counsel. Just Treasury, Finance, and 3 junior analysts who probably think cross-default sounds like a yoga position. No revision log, no audit trail, no change metadata in the document footer. They didn't revise it in good faith. They did it in darkness. And the most troubling part, they believed nobody would notice. I closed my laptop, sat there in the darkness with my phone screen providing the only illumination like a confession booth. Someone was attempting to rewrite institutional history. Perhaps they thought it was cleaner this way. Less regulatory complexity, less legacy paranoia, as Owen Harper had phrased it in his keynote presentation 3 quarters back. But you don't get to edit out legal liability because it's inconvenient. That's not simplification. That's institutional malpractice. And now I possessed evidence. I opened my secure vault, retrieved the original 2020 protocol, time-stamped, legally notarized, uploaded to our internal control server with certified hard copies distributed to legal, risk management, and the CFO personally. It even contained his digital signature right there adjacent to mine. You can delete protective provisions from a slide deck, but you can't delete the version that exists in 3 offline archives and a certified backup vault in Nevada. I downloaded a copy for safekeeping. Let them believe they'd buried it. Let them present their carefully curated charts. Because now I wasn't just observing anymore. I was preparing. I lit a candle rather than turning on the overhead light. Not for atmosphere, just for mental clarity. There's something about candlelight that sharpens your thinking. Especially when you're about to examine a system designed to remain forgotten. My fingers moved automatically. External encrypted drive. Secure volume. Archive folder labeled with a joke nobody but me would ever understand. Harper PDF file inside. The complete 2020 asset seizure protocol. Drafted post-Castellan collapse. Notarized by external counsel. Co-signed by legal and archived deep in a subfolder after the market recovered and everyone grew complacent about governance again. But I hadn't grown complacent. I don't forget structural vulnerabilities. I catalog them. Provision 9.2b stared back at me like an old friend I'd almost forgotten. Should any entity listed under Appendix C breach its designated leverage threshold or fail to meet scheduled remittance per outlined cadence, immediate lien enforcement shall be triggered across all listed entities under cross-default provisions without requirement for board approval. No ambiguity, no weasel words, just a loaded net strung between 42 legally distinct entities waiting. I scrolled to Appendix C. The names flooded back into my memory. Revix subsidiaries, holding companies, shell entities, offshore structures. Each mapped with unique identifiers and specific trigger thresholds. Not organized alphabetically. By exposure classification. Because that's how institutional bleeding happens. Not all at once. Just one small slip. An overlooked remittance, a mistimed wire transfer, a trigger clause buried on page 173 of a vendor agreement. And there, positioned midway through the list, was one I didn't recognize from the original drafting period. VC Holdco 83. Quietly inserted during the 2024 expansion period. No footnote explanation, no revision trail, but explicitly linked to a 3.2x leverage ceiling and 85-day remittance cadence. I opened the debt servicing schedule from last quarter. Retrieved their remittance records. 87 days overdue. Just barely over the threshold. And that single delay didn't just put VC Holdco 83 at risk. It pulled the entire net taut. Because under Provision 9.2b, the cross-default mechanism wasn't about who failed. It was about whether anyone did. And someone had. I sat back, pulse steady. They'd walked me out believing I was just a risk strategist who took her spreadsheets too seriously. Someone they could soft punish with a compensation freeze and expect to fade into LinkedIn obscurity. But what they'd forgotten, what they'd never truly understood, was that I hadn't built traps. I'd built containment systems. The kind you pray never gets tested. Provision 9.2b wasn't a threat. It was a pressure relief valve. For the moment when the CFO or some overambitious strategist reached too far and hoped nobody would notice the foundation starting to buckle. And now that pressure valve was armed. Because while they'd been playing cleanup with fake deck revisions and blank audit footers, I'd been running exposure maps on a shell entity they never thought would matter. Hell no. They'd removed the enforcement mechanisms thinking it was legacy dead weight. What they'd actually done was disarm their own safety system. And I was holding the activation code. They thought I was gone. That was their first mistake. At 9:43 a.m. on New Year's Day, the boardroom lights at Revix Capital flickered on. Someone arranged coffee service. Someone else struggled with the video conferencing connection. Phones muted, professional smiles rehearsed. The quarterly performance theater about to commence, presented in bullet points, charts and selective institutional memory. And quietly, unnoticed, I logged in from a rental cabin 4 states away, still wrapped in a wool sweater, drinking terrible instant coffee, watching the sun climb over frozen mountains. My content management credentials were still completely active. Nobody had revoked them. Nobody had even thought to check. I was the one who had built half the permission architecture to begin with, and nobody ever rewrites the scripts if they don't know those scripts exist. They'd eliminated my title, frozen my compensation, scrubbed my enforcement provisions from the deck, but they hadn't changed the digital logs. At 9:49 a.m., I uploaded a single slide into the live boardroom materials portal, the one that synchronizes automatically across every tablet device in that sterile glass-lined conference room. No warning, no email subject line, just a file labeled Provision _ 9.2b under default under activation under analysis. Slide title in bold. Unreported covenant breach via VC Holdco 83. Subheading: Trigger threshold exceeded December 31, 2024. Cascade risk assessment. Active. Below that, a cascading flowchart of all 42 linked entities, color-coded by exposure severity. One line glowing red. 6 others amber. The rest flickering like dying stars. And at the bottom, a notation in legal typeface. Original provision notarized and validated 2020. Last confirmed active Q4 2024 per certified audit chain. Clean, unemotional, sharp as broken glass. Not a threat. At 9:53 a.m. the system audit log confirmed full synchronization. The slide was opened on every device, viewed by all 8 directors. A silent ripple in a perfectly scripted morning. No explosion, just a pause. A pause long enough to fracture everything open. Because unlike finance's glittering charts and curated optimism, this slide wasn't up for debate. It was a switch already flipped, irreversible. And the provision was live. They could ignore it, but the general counsel wouldn't. Legal's job isn't to feel secure. It's to know when they're not. And this provision was the nightmare scenario. The one you mentioned during due diligence calls with a nervous chuckle and pray never activates. And it just had. The call hadn't even officially started yet. I closed my laptop, didn't watch the video feed, didn't need to. Because sometimes revenge doesn't require volume. Just one quiet moment where the room reads your slide and realizes they don't even know where the emergency exits are. It was supposed to be a celebration. The CFO had worn his most expensive tie, even cracked a joke during the attendance roll call. New year, new performance targets, he said with that particular kind of smug confidence that comes from someone who hasn't slept properly in a week but thinks he can fake it through sheer bravado and spreadsheets. Slide 17. Liquidity positioning. Slide 18. Debt coverage ratios. Slide 19. Someone coughed. Long pause. Said a voice. Probably Rachel from strategic planning. What's this slide doing here? Silence. Owen Harper blinked, froze mid-gesture. The vein in his temple, always a reliable indicator, started pulsing visibly. Oh, he said, chuckling nervously. That wasn't in the original packet. Another voice cut through, sharper, older. Is this some kind of mistake? They were looking at it now. Provision 9.2b cross-default activation analysis. Red lines, amber entities. The words unreported covenant breach burned into the bottom corner like a brand. The general counsel's voice unmuted with a soft electronic click. Oh, and she said, cold as January frost. That provision was still enforceable. The CFO leaned forward, mouth already forming words, and stammered. We retired it last fiscal year during the... You retired it. Her tone didn't rise. Didn't need to. It was never formally sunset, she said, flat and final. There's no record of formal rescission, no board authorization, no notice to risk management, and definitely no legal sunset filing in the provision registry. The CFO blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish trying to breathe through cement. Someone else asked, is this the same provision from the Castellan situation? The general counsel answered immediately. Worse. Castellan was external counterparty risk. This one's internal breach. Which entity? Someone whispered. VC Holdco 83, another voice replied. One of the holding companies from last spring. Under finance. The CFO exhaled hard. This is being misinterpreted. The remittance delay is insignificant. The general counsel didn't even acknowledge him. We've exceeded the trigger threshold, she said, voice tightening with each word. Which means if we don't proactively disclose this before market close and it surfaces publicly, we are exposed to cross-default litigation across 42 entities. A throat cleared uncomfortably. Does anyone know who uploaded this? The CEO asked, low and tense. Nobody spoke. Of course they knew. They didn't say it explicitly, but they knew. Because only one person had ever maintained that provision. Only one person had authored the subsidiary schedule. Only one person they tried to bury with a compensation freeze and institutional indifference. Me. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. The silence communicated everything. The power dynamic had shifted. Not with a press release, not with litigation, just one ghost slide in the middle of their perfect narrative, reminding them that the person they'd sidelined still held the original architectural blueprints. They'd built their empire on my protocols. And now those protocols had come home. Not to destroy the house. Just to prove who'd actually built it. At 10:27 a.m. precisely, almost to the exact second the board call ended, my inbox chimed. Subject. Immediate clarification required, provision review. No greeting, no apology, just 11 paragraphs of polished panic disguised as professionalism. The kind of email that says, we're not admitting anything but we're acutely aware that we just stepped on a landmine while wearing tap shoes. They wanted to arrange for an urgent discussion regarding recent contractual interpretations. Requested mutual understanding on exposure implications. Asked if I could revisit in good faith the operational legacy surrounding Provision 9.2b. In other words, we didn't think you'd remember what you built. We didn't think we'd need you again, but now the grown-ups are in the room and they're asking where the actual adult is. I didn't reply immediately. I stood, stretched, refilled my terrible instant coffee, watched a bird land on the frozen railing of the cabin porch. Small, calm, free. Then I sat down and opened the compensation schedule. Section 7C, final page. There it was, my clause, not highlighted, not underlined, but written with surgical precision by yours truly. In the event of an unreported breach connected to executive acquisition activity or concealed subsidiary incorporation, all provision authors of original cross-default frameworks shall be compensated in accordance with Schedule D for systemic exposure mitigation. Schedule D, incidentally, being the emergency valuation clause that assigns compensation tiers to any protective author whose provision results in systemic exposure mitigation after attempted sunset. They'd forgotten it existed. I hadn't. So I copied it, pasted it into a reply. That was the entire email. Just that quote followed by 3 sentences. My banking details remain unchanged. Kindly confirm remittance timeline and amount. Oh wait. No salutation, no soft edges, and definitely no meeting request. Because I didn't need to revisit anything. I had written the damn thing. While they were shaking hands and staging press conferences, I was poring over debt structures and mapping breach pathways like a surgeon tracking blood vessels before the first incision. They'd buried my enforcement mechanisms thinking they were obsolete. But you don't kill a protection protocol. You just forget it exists until it remembers you. The next email arrived at 10:41 a.m. No subject. Just a one-line reply from legal. We are reviewing Schedule D immediately. Thank you for your clarity and patience. I closed my laptop. Didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. Because I hadn't won anything. I'd simply returned to the space they'd left wide open when they mistook silence for absence. They thought I'd built safety nets. I hadn't. I'd built consequences. It was tucked in like a dirty secret, positioned 3 inches above a page break in the Q1 regulatory filing appendix, right between amortization schedules and something about deferred tax liabilities. Footnote 63. Remediation compensation related to cross-default provision activation per 2020 systemic framework. No name mentioned, no specific figure disclosed, no drama. But I knew. Because that phrase per 2020 systemic framework was mine. Every syllable, every comma. The language hadn't been modified since the night I drafted it in a locked office with 3 phones ringing simultaneously and a legal associate having a breakdown quietly in the copy room because the Castellan collapse had just erased 19% of our paper value overnight. That provision had existed in shadows for 5 years. No press releases, no public acknowledgement, just quiet institutional power. And now it was the reason an 8-figure wire transfer had landed in my account at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon without a single phone call, meeting, or non-disclosure agreement. Compensation. Not for loyalty but for leverage. I was on the cabin porch when I read the filing, wrapped in a sweater older than my last 4 managers combined. Boots propped on the railing, coffee cooling in the mountain wind. The landscape was absolutely silent. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you, just allows you to exist. My phone buzzed. It was Rachel from legal. A simple text message. Slide of the century. I didn't reply. What was there to say? They'd tried to erase the provision. Instead, it had carved itself into the institutional ledger, undeniable and permanent, exactly as I'd designed it to. Me. I didn't need a press release. I didn't need their apology. Because in the end they didn't eliminate me. They proved I was indispensable through their own negligence. I closed the regulatory filing, took another sip of coffee, reached under the porch table and pulled out the black leather notebook I kept stored away for moments like this. Quiet ones heavy with closure. Labeled the back page, Provision 9.2b, Resolved. Then I filed it away like I'd never left. But here's the thing about institutional architecture that nobody teaches you in business school or risk management certification courses. The systems you build don't just protect the people who pay you. They protect themselves. And when those systems activate, they don't care about politics or hierarchy or who signed the compensation freeze memo. They just execute. Exactly as designed. 3 weeks later, I received another email. This one from Owen Harper directly. No corporate speak, no forwarded chains, just 5 sentences. Madison, we need you back. Not as senior derivative strategist. As chief risk officer. Full board seat. Name your terms. I read it twice. Sat with it for approximately 6 hours. Watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the snow gold and then purple and then black. Made another terrible cup of instant coffee. Thought about 12 years of being invisible until I became unavoidable. Then I replied, I'll consider it. Send me the complete organizational chart, every subsidiary entity structure, and full access to the last 18 months of board minutes. I'll review and respond within a week. Also, I'll need Owen Harper's written acknowledgement that Provision 9.2b was never properly sunset and remains in full effect. In writing. Signed. Notarized. And one more thing. The analyst who wrote that compensation freeze memo? I want their name. Not for revenge. For due diligence. I sent the email at 9:57 p.m. on a Tuesday. The same time Owen Harper had questioned why I was still working at 2 in the morning all those weeks ago. Seemed appropriate. The reply came back in 47 minutes. Every document I'd requested, plus 3 additional ones I hadn't. And at the bottom, a scanned PDF with Owen Harper's signature, notarized that same afternoon. Formal acknowledgement that Provision 9.2b was never legally sunset and remains in full enforceable effect across all subsidiary entities of Revix Capital. The analyst's name was included too. Turned out it was Lucas Bennett from Treasury. The same one who'd tried to quietly remove the provision from the board deck. The same one who'd forgotten that institutional memory doesn't live in PowerPoint slides. It lives in people like me who build the systems and remember exactly how they work. I didn't respond immediately. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Because the thing about leverage is this. Once you prove you have it, you don't need to use it constantly. You just need people to remember it exists. I returned to Revix Capital on a Monday morning in late January. No fanfare, no announcement email, just a new badge with a new title waiting at security. Chief Risk Officer. Office on the executive floor, glass walls overlooking the city, the kind of view they give people they can't afford to lose. Owen Harper was waiting in my new office when I arrived. Coffee already brewing, my old files transferred to the new system, even a small plant on the desk that I'd left behind weeks earlier. He'd remembered. Welcome back, he said quietly. We should have done this years ago. I set my bag down, looked around the space, then looked at him directly. Yes, I said simply. You should have. He nodded, accepting that without argument. Fair enough. So where do we start? I pulled out my laptop, opened the derivative exposure matrix I'd been maintaining externally, and projected it onto the large monitor on the wall. 42 entities, color-coded, interconnected, pulsing with real-time data feeds I'd never stopped monitoring. We start, I said calmly, by making sure nobody ever forgets how this architecture works again. We start by documenting every single protective provision, every trigger mechanism, every cascade protocol. And we start by making absolutely certain that the next time someone thinks they can quietly remove a safeguard I built, they understand exactly what they're actually removing. Owen Harper stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll set up a board presentation for next week. You'll present directly. Full hour. No interruptions. Good, I replied. And one more thing. He looked at me waiting. That compensation freeze memo. I want it formally retracted. In writing. Distributed to the same list that received the original. With an acknowledgement that the characterization was incorrect. He didn't hesitate. Done. I'll have HR draft it this afternoon. I nodded. Then we have an agreement. We shook hands. Professional, clean, transactional. No apologies, no dramatic speeches about lessons learned. Just a clear understanding that the institutional architecture had reasserted itself exactly as designed. Because that's the thing about building systems that protect people who don't appreciate them. Eventually, those systems force appreciation. Not through destruction but through activation. And sometimes the person